Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Lydia Matthews, and we're happy, very excited, actually, to have Shazia Sikander with us this evening. I just wanted to say this is sort of the turning point in that it's the last lecture in our Fine Arts, Parsons Fine Arts series for this semester. And so we're moving towards winter break, but we anticipate having another really amazing lineup for the spring. So keep your eyes open for that. That will begin the beginning of February when school commences again. So we hope that many of you will be back. We know our students will be back, but for those of you who are from other places, and I see a lot of unfamiliar faces tonight in the audience. So welcome to Parsons, and do come back and join us for future events. Tonight, one of our MFA painters, actually, Eleana Antonaki, is going to give the introduction for Shazia. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have Shazia Sikander tonight. Pakistani-born and internationally recognized Shazia Sikander's pioneering practice takes Indo-Persian miniature painting, a traditional style that is both highly stylized and disciplined, as a point of departure. Sikander received her BFA in 1991 from the National College of Art in Lahore, Pakistan, and her MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1995. She challenges the strict formal tropes of miniature painting as well as its medium-based restriction by experimenting with scale and media, including animation, video, performance, and large-scale murals and installations, and collaboration with other artists. Her process-based work is concerned with examining the forces at stake in contested cultural and political histories. Sikander's innovative expansion on this traditional genre helped launch a major resurgence of work with contemporary miniature painting, beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s at her alma mater in Lahore, which spread and brought international recognition to this medium within contemporary art practices. Shazia Sikander has participated in more than 500 group exhibitions, and her work has been part of the Istanbul Biennial, the Venice Biennial, the Whitney Biennial, the Taipei Biennial, among many, many others. She has received numerous awards. It was really hard to select some of them. The list was so large. Such as the inaugural Medal of Art by Hillary Clinton in the USA, the National Medal of Excellence, Government and State of Pakistan, the John Mitchell Award, and the John D. and Catherine D. MacArthur Genius Award, among others. Please welcome Shazia Sikander.
It's always a treat for me to come in a space of student activity. It's the energy is always infectious, and I just reminisce the time when I was a student. And also, I think the energy of New York City to be sort of giving a lecture and meet the students here in the city is very special. And I was thinking I don't actually do much more of it here. I end up doing a lot of lectures outside of the city, and so it's been even more interesting for me to move from a project that I just recently did in Times Square and be able to speak about it here rather than elsewhere, because the perception of Times Square is also very interesting, how it shifts. So I'm going to go right into the project, which was playing during the month of October, and it was through the Times Square Arts Alliance. The title of the piece, Gopi, Contagion, is actually based on the Gopi motif, which is the hair that I culled off of female followers of the Hindu god Krishna. So what you see here is the Gopi hair motif as a flock reflecting behavior of cellular forms that have reached self-organized criticality, resulting in a redistribution of both visual information and experiential memory. The hair motif particle is modified to behave and simulate various states of both liquid and solid. The millions of silhouettes of hair are seen transforming into large swaths of static noise that hover between multiple representations ranging from ocean, water, oil, to flocks of birds, bats, insects, patterns of human migration, and of collective behavior. Gopis, the female followers of Hindu deity, have been a recurring visual trope in my work. What I am using in Gopi Contagion is just the unit, the hair, which is divorced from the female body itself. And thus, it's a fairly rigid shape. But by isolating the hair from its associated female figure, I'm basically emphasizing its ability to cultivate new meaning. When the piece comes on, it is so visually different from the hyperactive, in-your-face commercials that it suspends the viewer's experience and allows them to question what they experienced and why. Some of the billboards are ABC News, CNN, American Eagle, NASDAQ, Reuters, Disney. You know, it was like that in itself was very interesting because I was asking people around what they thought of the work, and I got some really interesting feedback. A group of tourists, actually from Australia, said that they loved the fruit bats swarming on the NASDAQ billboard. They thought it was rather appropriate and dark. For me, that was like one of the best responses because I could have asked for. If you look at the photos of the event, the Gopi hair swarms are full of fervor, incomprehensible, but omnipresent, hovering covertly above the headline news of college shooter Chris Harper, in this particular one, running on the ABC billboards, sandwiched between the Mindy Project and the Bank of America, and NASDAQ billboards with the US neon flag beautifully lit on the side. So the fervor of the swarm was always meant to elicit multiple reads, multiple meanings, and at midnight, it is sublime and subversive. As an artist, I utilize the creative process to formulate often a critique of various issues, whether cultural, social, political, things that interest me, to interpret questions and ideas of cultural histories and related expectations. Collaboration with other artists, writers, scholars, and contributors is often integral to the successful creation of my work. In this work also, there was a partnership with a composer that I've worked with in the past, Duyan, and the score itself could be accessed via SoundCloud. So this was the first time that I ended up using LED panels or testing the visual material that the visual digital data on these incredible LED screens. But in the past, what I have been primarily doing is working with projection. And projection that is obviously dependent on projectors, and then the range and quality of projectors, especially if one is interested in projecting outdoors, is becomes quite a bit of a issue. These were projections that were done at the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art in Honolulu, Hawaii. When I was doing a residency there, I became interested in Doris Duke's history and her interest, in the 30s in architecture, in Isfahan architecture, how that influenced the choices she made in conceiving and having this house of hers constructed. So it was a very interesting insight into a period of American Orientalism and to sort of like understand it, and yet at the same time be interested in the range and craftsmanship that was visible and available for me as an artist to study. So I think what was expected of me was to like look at her collections and maybe peruse through them for ideas. And I was like less interested in that and more interested in the outdoors, because for some reason the landscape around the house itself, but also the landscape of Hawaii, was so magical and different from anything else I had experienced. So I started to do the drawings and project them directly into space. So these are just documentation of those events. And what interested me a lot was the idea of the book. So I was looking at the illuminated manuscripts and then thought that I would create the book itself, but then project the image of the book as an object into space. The intent was to illuminate the space with light as a medium, exposing the hidden, unseen elements of the darkness. The light source functions simultaneously as a temporary sculpture captured by the moving trees and foliage on which it falls. So I see this functioning in a parallel way to language, in how words uncover expression. The use of text can loosely be put into two categories in my work, one that informs me and one that takes shape in the work itself. In addition to exploring the factors that are basically involved in historical redaction, I'm also interested in historical writing, that is language and its translation. What is translation? How is translation related to the original? This was a show I curated at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum in 2009. And what you see here is objects and paintings that I culled from Cooper's permanent collection. The juxtapositions, I think, inherent in this work, in this project, were of primary interest. So objects that I culled from the collections and then drew their relationships with each other, and then in response to that process was making work. So for example, here is a drawing that I found. It's signatures of as a practice sheet of signatures of an artist. And I thought that juxtaposing that with other aspects of use of language was, for me, like a way of showing the multiplicity of how signatures related to authority, to the idea of identity, and how over time authority becomes an approximation. So notions about authenticity, identification, replication, that continue to be part of my work were explored here. For example, the declaration of the signatures from the Declaration of Independence. Cooper has a huge jacquard collection. So this particular work was the one that I selected. And while I was looking at it, what interested me about it was that it was already a facsimile of the copy of a copy. So that I was particularly taken by that idea, and in response made a work questioning that my replication of the replication would explore the idea of contamination further. Thus, time emerges as the nemesis to authority. Often the use of writing, for me, draws upon all such implications as I think about translation's relationship to a tradition and tradition with all its inherent redactions. These are large drawings, 6 by 10 feet, and the title of this series is called Practice Makes Perfect. In one, the phrase is in English, like in this one, and in the other, the phrase within the work is in Urdu script. The one in Urdu translates to, I am also not my own enemy, and the one in English, I am the exact imitation of the original. The repetition of the phrase is a comment on rote learning. As the writing builds and drips, it also transforms itself into a cage-like form. Language becomes fluid and chaotic, yet the chaos is just under the surface of the skin of the painting. Another example here is a text that I took by writing out the word murder, murderer, and murdered in both Hebrew and Arabic. And then as I rewrote it, it reassembled itself till it started to look like a ball of barbed wire. Transformation as the narrative in both the drawings and the animations is also a metaphor for the real and the fabricated. For this duality, there is a chase where the hunter and prey are entangled. The title of this work, Pursuit Curve, this is an animation, refers to a mathematical term for a path an object takes when chasing another object. Who is pursuing whom, and when does the pursuer become pursued? My art is built with a lexicon of information which grows and expands, is reused, edited, discarded, and new ideas added. To move forward is to rethink and to be able to detach, to explore something new. Identity is not a given, but a fluid process that unfolds over time. In this permanent work, which is at the Halls Foundation in California, the building itself alters at night into a Tower of Babel. Over the years, I have worked in a variety of mediums, different formats, small detailed paintings, murals, and video work, animation. Here is a juxtaposition of two works. One is like a very early work at the top, titled The Scroll, one of the earliest works I made, and then one of the most recent works. And the points of the juxtaposition here between both is very intentional. I still, when I see them and place them next to each other, I see numerous points of connection. The interest in shifting the idea of scale and space to push the traditional notebook page painting into a 5-foot miniature, which was done early on when I was still in undergrad. And then in this multi-channel work, the scale of 12 by 100 feet is intensely immersive, especially when the score is also performed live. But both these works hint at the possibility of infinite space and multiple representations moving beyond their literal borders as well as the edges. So over the years that I have worked with different formats and interest in interlinking interdisciplinary media, the core at the work has always been my interest in Indian Persian miniature painting, which I studied for many years in Pakistan and post-Pakistan also, but that idea of working in the so-called notion of tradition interests me because I think classifying tradition is a very complex aspect because where in time do you determine what is traditional and at what point does the traditional become less traditional? So all of that casting that relationship with one's own history is very interesting. In the late 80s, when I put this thesis up, the one at the top, The Scroll, it was a breakthrough in many ways. It was the first time that anyone in the miniature painting genre had attempted to create a 5-foot miniature painting. it took me almost like more than a year to make this work, and that also at like 18 hours of work every day. It's very, very detailed and heavily broken down in its surface treatment with very thin brushes and lots of layers. It's influenced by Safavid style of painting, and at the same time, I was looking at film and structure of narrative and thematic in film space primarily to make the paintings. So I was going beyond the boundaries of what was required at that time, which was to create something within a thematic scale, a thematic representation. So my interest was to insert the personal into the thematic space, explore the insertion of the youth, the flux of identity, narrative as a moving image, and picture plane as an infinite space. So the drawings now, moving on, also vary in medium. These are like ink drawings that I often employ for creating animation. I think ink for me lends itself automatically. It's such a fluid material that there's inherent movement in it, and how to engage with a very unpredictable material and try to capture it also lends itself, to the unpredictability, which I think pushes not just the idea of movement, but also how images are interdependent with material itself. I have explored issues of labor, scale, space, particularly in the early mid-90s, when I was taking elements out of the small drawings and placing them in ephemeral situations like temporary walls and floor drawings. These are really early works. This was at the Hirshhorn in '99, which is very interesting at my age now to reflect back and say, I actually had a retrospective at the age of 29, and which is ridiculous, but it was a very strange thing to contemplate now. So this was a show at the solo show at the Hirshhorn. These are like later projects in various places. This is at the Icon in Birmingham. So works done sort of in various site-specific situations also have like a earlier history, as early as 93, 96 at Yorba Buena, and then also at the Whitney Museum, where I had a solo show in 1999. All of this early work that engaged wall and installation basically laid out the foundation for many new directions with which I would engage with the medium of miniature painting itself, extending its domain to include large-scale public murals, wall drawings, multimedia installations, and then also at the same time working with other artists. These works are done simultaneously on site. Directly, the drawings are done on paper. Some of the drawings is done on the wall. The whole piece is very alive. It has a lot of flexibility. It also has improvisation. And when I look at this work, I think that it has already the underpinnings for the works that I did in mid-2000. The layering in this work is very similar to the layering that comes through in animation, and the direction towards animation, I think, is in similar strategy, because I basically use After Effects, and that too has like a whole device of layering. This was done at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo with Yuko Hasegawa. And here you can see how the scale of the work is about 25, 28 feet long drawings. And they were also done in ink while on site. And the paper itself is very transparent and yet very tenacious. it allows you to look through the layers and at the same time creates density and opacity when you move around it. And sometimes the depth of the piece has gone from 10, 12 inches to 8, 10 feet. So the physicality of the paper becomes like an essential component of the work itself. So I see them as ruptures or departures that happened and from the painting itself, and they were both varied in technique, form. So I was thinking in terms of the center-margin relationships in a typical miniature painting, because miniature painting accompanied book illustrations, so it has a very distinct relationship to borders. And here I was dislocating the framing devices, not just formally, but also to open up narratives of gender and identity. Another recent project is done in an abandoned site that I came across when driving in UAE, Sharjah, while doing research for the Sharjah Art Biennial's project that I ended up making. So this is in 2012, and the cinema itself was it just was instinctively familiar. And so when I actually ended up visiting and going inside, the guard, or the person who was actually illegally living inside, was from Pakistan, and he was a laborer who had come to build the cinema in 1976. So that instinct was so right on, because he shared the architectural drawings, which he had under lock and key. Like, they were the cinema was commissioned by engineers and architects from Karachi. And so what interested me the most was that the building, full of character, was in a state of decay, dying a slow death. Amongst the fast UAE building culture, the stagnating space felt like an anomaly. So the sole guard, who is from Pakistan and who came as a laborer to build the cinema, is now in the space. So his story is completely unexpected, but it ends up being woven into the work, less as an illustration and more as a random moment of illumination. So I see both our paths crossing over in a very transitory space, also in a cultural space which is very elusive. I think growing up in Pakistan, the proximity to UAE is very familiar, and yet not. There's a lot of family members that have moved through there, that have lived there. A lot of people from Pakistan go and different economic strata goes and passes through UAE, whether as laborers or migrant labor, or even in terms of like younger generation that finds better jobs there. But it's a very transitory relationship, even in my experience. So I was interested in exploring that. The text in here is called is a phrase from Ghalib, Urdu poet, that translates as the Cyprus, despite its freedom, is held captive to the garden. So what was very compelling for me was that the caretaker's visa was still attached to the building. So he was technically married to this building. And that was mind-blowing for me, because it was like the imminent death of the cinema was becoming a metaphor for his life's labor. Whereas he, on the other hand, spoke of the space as if it was still alive and functional, unable to see the layers of dust and decay around him, a sole survivor held captive to a dream. So I have often worked with Ghalib's poetry, because his poetry is very multidimensional, has multiple meanings, and I think that type of freedom to have specificity and multiplicity running simultaneously seems to be at the forefront of a lot of work I do. So moving on from that experience, I ended up doing these drawings. And these drawings, what I realized later was that the caretaker becomes the protagonist in this work. Here you see the 14, 15-inch drawing, and then its counterpart is at 70 feet. So this is when I start to think about like how I want to create these drawings while I'm visiting and engaging and researching Sharjah's site, to really think about creating a piece which would be interdisciplinary, would be multi-channel, would probably be cinematic, and would shift in scale to a much different scale than I had previously been working in. So the caretaker moves through a variety of guises, and he often represents uncertainty and change. And I think those were two topics that I held on to in terms of how to give form and visual content to the idea of change, which is different from how I think in terms of transformation. In this work now, the protagonist is someone else. This is a still from an animation I did called The Last Post. And it can be seen as a metaphor for societies in flux. It is also an outcome of my ongoing interest in the colonial history of the subcontinent. The title, The Last Post, refers to the bugle call. Commemorating the soldiers who die in war, it also signals a call for the end of the day. The protagonist here is the East India Company man, who appears in various guises throughout the piece, often as a lurking threat in the imperial rooms of the Mughal Empire, which once ruled much of South Asia. So it also refers to the collapse of the Anglo-Saxon hegemony over China. So I was interested obviously in the East India Company. And focus on economics has always been of relevance to the visual content of my work. Especially the last several years, I have been exploring the histories that have informed our modern economy. The British East India Company had a lasting impact on strategies of corporate operations. The colonial economy and how we still exist in similar economic operations to how it existed in the 17th century. So that type of relationship is very similar to how I think of the visual language of the company school of painting, which is what I'm referring to in this entire piece. So the piece is entirely drawn, and the style of painting that I'm engaged with is company school painting, which existed in India under the English Empire. Recent and new works explore movement, whether it's waterways, aerial, aquatic routes, the movement of bodies, objects in land, sea, or air that circulate. Interest in the mechanisms that execute these exchanges, such as trade, airplanes, boats, cars, and foot traffic. Which brings me to this work. This painting, I think, is so creative because it was so much fun to make. Because I think the best part for me was that I was also able to write about it. And it's got a lot packed in it. It was created for the New York Times op-ed last year. The painting title is "The World is Yours, the World is Mine." And it's a response to the events of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014. It spread to Europe, and the US introduced a narrative suggesting an unease with connectivity in a supposedly hyper-connected and globalized world. To draw a parallel along the lines of interconnectivity, I focused on figures of Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes and hip-hop artist Nas as two storytellers who have distinct relationships with lyric verse and who also serve to shape a collective narrative by uniting disparate elements. So modes of storytelling like painting and rap allow us to engage with personal stories, becoming the vehicle through which history passes. This particular work that I just shared with you also has its roots in iconography that is just evolving always in my work. Here you see the idea of the singing sphere and the motif of the hair and the use of gold. These drawings lent themselves to another work that I created called the Gold Oasis. And the score of this is also Africa Must Wake Up by Nas and Damian Marley. But basically it invites viewers to reimagine historical content and entrenched symbols and challenge and re-examine our histories. So the idea, say, of the singing sphere is also linked to other works that I've done where fragmentation in my work represents the interstitial state. Fractured and fragmented forms coalesce into new states of identity to challenge the previous representations. So I also work in layers, as I mentioned earlier, in both conceptually, physically, digitally, like After Effects are used for animating the drawings, and the endless layers that can be built in digital space and can be reorganized infinitely lend themselves to volume in terms of information and content. So the audio for this work is also layered in tracks, and it moves between various visual and sound juxtapositions, and basically allows the narrative for the viewer to navigate the narrative. Live performances have also occurred, so the score is often performed live. I will be showing this work at the end of the lecture. The last section of this animation basically is about hope. So the singing spheres, as I call them, are 6 spherical allygrammatic movements that cast a buoyant interplay between the poet's recitation and the ensuing movement paths created from the Gopi particles. The spheres pulsate, gather momentum, increase and decrease speed, all in response to the thrust of the human voices, thus the singing spheres. The score was conceived and composed in collaboration with composer Diane and poets. Diane has worked on several of my pieces, and she also performs live. Here are in various installation forms. This is at the Rockbund Museum in Shanghai. Live performances that happened. This one was at the Sharjah Art Biennial in UAE with the actual performers. Some of the language in the work comes out of my interest in cartography, and the drawings that I made for the work Parallax, which I will share now, were done in gouache and ink while traveling. So I was interested in my proximity to heat, water, sand, and I was trying to understand how the sensorial aspect of the sight that I was experiencing could be translated into drawing itself. So as I thought of that, I thought of the idea of literally driving on the terrain itself and then driving within the terrain of a painting. So what I ended up doing was scanning the work at very, very high resolution. So when it's scaled up to 80 feet or so, the piece itself is less about the visibility of the drawing, but the unseen part of the drawings get expanded. To just focus on how imagery evolves in the work, this particular projection of the Christmas tree came about when I was looking at different things here, in particular photographs in British petroleum magazines of the 60s. So here you can see the basically the oil rig at that time is called the Christmas tree. So that for me was like very interesting idea, maybe the English wit, maybe the idea of like the inherent gift-bearing sentiments of oil. But I ended up making using that premise to create the actual Christmas trees with the spools and the chains as garlands. And the piece itself, Parallax, examines mechanisms of power, ideas of conflict, tension, over control of strategically desired geography, a place where 1/5 of world's total oil passes. Parallax investigates discourse styles, both verbal, poetic languages, migratory patterns, the idea of cultural quarantine, interaction, and at the core of it, it is still the notion of identity. It is a multi-channel work comprised of many drawings that have been digitally animated. The focus is primarily on maritime trade in the Strait of Hormuz and the fraught history of imperial control. The interest is in dislocation of objects and forms and how meaning is constantly in flux. Historically, the movement of objects, such as in trade and colonial occupation, allow their meaning to shift as they enter different contexts. So in this sense, the animation allows me to work with and challenge limits imposed by the single sheet of paper. So I see of that, like the limitation of paper, almost as a similar way of moving past borders. Movement can be literal, as in the physical crossing of geographical borders by body, species, commodities, resources. It can also be symbolic, as borders have the capacity to function as abstract concepts that contribute, often in very real and material ways, to the sense of belonging or exclusion from a geographically determined space. The music was made, is purely in Arabic because the site is in the region, so it made a lot of sense for me to keep the score in Arabic, to work with local poets. And it engages the vernacular while its points of reference remain universal. It is very much about the lens of emotion, how through emotion one can cast a relationship to distance. And the idea of emotional cartography is a parallel. For me, growing up in Pakistan, I have a special kind of a very close relationship to this idea of experiencing Arabic, but with very little understanding. I think that ritual or rote relationship to a language is similar to this whole premise of like how, at what point is translation needed or required or essential. And I think for me, what has been an interesting observation is to see how Parallax has been traveling for the last 2 years. It's currently at Tufts University and maybe came down last week at the Guggenheim in Spain, but it has traveled in Europe, it's traveled to Bangladesh, it's traveled to maybe a lot of places where Arabic is not understood. And I offered the synopsis of the poems. It's available, but it's not necessarily essential. And I have not really experienced people asking to explain what the poetry is about. And I find that very interesting because my interest in, and Diane's interest was in the ability of that language to create a melodic sensibility and to sort of question the in-between space in that event, what is at operation that allows that type of an experience to happen. And I think that fundamentally sums up the experience of being an artist, as a visual artist in particular, engaged primarily in drawing, and how drawing is the fundamental tool for me to think through ideas and then to expand outward into space and world, and then compress inwards into the space of an artist and into the space of the studio. I think I'm going to end here, though I have many more slides. Maybe it would be nice to show the animation and then have enough time to engage the students.
جلفار يا جلفار إني مغرم وهواك أبعد بالسهاد منام والها تسع عجاف قد أكلن سنابلي وسلبن من نار الصداع الحامية والهاجس المزروع في رئة الرؤى أدمى طموحي واستباح صوابي كل المواكب للكواكب سافرت كل المواكب للكواكب سافرت إلا دروبي لا تزال جوافيا أتصحر للرأي في عهد الندى ويلاه بل هم صادروا أفكاري قد هاجر الإبداع مكسور الخطى متلفتا نحو الأهالي شاكيا هذه أساطير الثقافة تشتكي وبدت أساطير الرواة رواسيا
أطلب طائرة للشعر وطائرة أخرى للحزن وشباكين من الرمان أتأمل بين زجاج الرمانة يجري مغتربا أشرب شاي تشرب لغتي الأولى حين شفتك أول مرة حين عرفتك كنت تحب الشاي الأخضر والمقهى كان يحب الشاي الأخضر وأنا بينكما بعض السكر أتردد هل أسقط في كأسك أم في كأس المقهى كنت أفكر للمقهى شرفة غيم كانت ترتاح عليها بعض الحوريات والموج المتردد يفتح أصداف الحب فلا لؤلؤ لا حلم ولا أمنيات والمقهى يعطفه قلق يبحث كان بجيب اللاطف عن آخر ورد كنت كتبته عن آخر ورد في زاوية المقهى أنت تركته خبأه الياطف ذات عبير في عينيه وعلى طاولة الصمت أغمض قهوته وأدى الإصرار على كفيه لم يفهم لغة الباب لم يكتب شيئا بعد فضع هناك يديه المقهى هل كان هنالك حقا مقهى من الشارع أمام الحمل بقهوة روحي وتمناك
الشقاء
محوت
أن
ذكر
تفهما
غيابي قضى جهتي
عامان من قلق
وعلى أنغام تصادم
عامان من قلق وموكب أسئلة
فلا
هي
أعرف
هكذا
أين أخبئ
مالي
تركت حكايتها
ليس اليوم يسكنني ولست أخشاك أنت الآن منقذتي أنت التي سأواري فيك سوءته هذه الوعود
وقفاه وتأملا عنقود قافية
في ليل مأتمه ولم مشيد له حصن بذاكرتي أمنت حضنك كوخا لست أملكه بالرغم من كونه قصرا تركت فيه
أنفاس أحلفي
وما
شجون صمتي إن غاب عنها
وجئت
لحظتين
دنياك مفتونا بحضرتها مستنفرا جئت مصحوبا بألويتي أتيت أغزل كحل الورد في مدني
تدرين من بالباب يسألها
وأخفت الوحد منتقيا تفاؤلا
وبعض قصائد مري سحابا مثقلا بالحب يا سقي انتظاري مري كأني ما عرفت الماء يوما أطفئي جمري وناري وأتته تهمس للأماكن لن أقول له كتبتك في قصيدة وأتته تعجن غيمة خجلا وتسكن
أتقافز على أطراف أصابع السهام وعلى أنغام تصاصي دقائق الثواني
هكذا
فلا أعرف أين أخبئ إنسانات زمان يتسارع جنون المصيب ويخيل إلي كأن مقاطع تحولت إلى مقاطع تلتقي الأحزان فتساقط هنا وهنا ليبدأ جسدي المرقط بطعنات الريح
ويورق الشعر في كراس ملهمة غدا سأطوي انتفاء الحظ في غسقي وأحكم الحب من آيات
ترهقني الارتفاعات
مثل
So, you know, the piece itself is meant to be very immersive. It's on a semi-circular format. It's about 60, 80 feet in scale. So it's also very difficult for me to see the work presented in this manner where the sound is not loud enough and the relationship can't be really casted. So when I was making the drawings for this work, the intent was to scale the drawing up to that type, to such a large, to scale it up in space so that it's not just the reproduction of the drawing or the physical enlargement of the drawing, but that to think in terms of the infinity of the parallel medium. So the digital medium is in itself becomes the theater in which the drawing is going to participate. And I think that in recent years has been much aided by access to high-end projectors, etc., that enhance the quality of the digital works, so the comparison with the drawing is removed.